Good morning. We're at the Imperial Valley Regional Airfield, where federal agents are carrying out what authorities call the largest single-day removal operation in recent memory. Behind me, chartered transport planes and a row of buses are moving people who officials say have final deportation orders. The effort is being led by...
The fluorescent lights in the Chicago field office hummed with the same monotonous frequency they always did, but that night felt different. I remember looking at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m., and thinking that in exactly 72 hours, we would execute the largest coordinated deportation operation in the history of immigration and customs enforcement. My name is Gregory Bovino. I've been with ICE for 23 years. I've seen administrations come and go, policies shift like sand dunes in the desert, and I've watched good agents burn out under the weight of a job that most Americans will never understand. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what we were about to undertake. Operation Silent Departure didn't begin in a boardroom or a political strategy session. It began with a murder. 7 months earlier, in a quiet suburb of Minneapolis, a 14-year-old girl named Emily Dawson was walking home from volleyball practice. She never made it. Her body was found 3 days later in an abandoned warehouse near the Mississippi River. The man who killed her was Rodrigo Meneses Cartagena, a Salvadoran national who had been deported twice before. Twice he had crossed back. Twice the system had failed. I was at Emily's funeral. I didn't know the family, but I needed to be there. I stood in the back, watching her mother collapse against her father's chest, and I made a promise to myself. No more half measures. No more bureaucratic delays. No more politics getting in the way of protecting innocent lives. When I returned to the office that Monday, I requested a meeting with Deputy Director Harrison Wells. Harrison was old school, like me, a former Marine who understood that sometimes you have to break eggs to make an omelet. I laid out my proposal, a coordinated, multi-state operation targeting the most dangerous criminal aliens in the country, not families seeking asylum, not restaurant workers overstaying visas, the predators, the killers, the gang leaders who had turned American cities into hunting grounds. Harrison listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for what felt like an eternity. "You know the political shitstorm this will create," he said finally. "Yes, sir. You know there will be protests, lawsuits, maybe even congressional hearings." "Yes, sir." He looked at me with those steel gray eyes that had seen combat in Fallujah. "How many can you get?" "If we do this right, 800, maybe more." Harrison stood up, walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline, and nodded slowly. "Then let's do this right." The next 6 months were the most intense of my career. I assembled a task force of 47 agents from field offices across the country: Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, New York, Phoenix, Denver. These weren't just agents, they were specialists, intelligence analysts who could trace a burner phone across 3 continents, surveillance experts who had spent years embedded with gang task forces, tactical operators who had trained with special forces. Our first priority was building the target list. We weren't casting a wide net, we were using a surgical scalpel. Every name on our list had to meet specific criteria: violent criminal history, deportation orders already in place, and documented gang affiliation or ties to transnational criminal organizations. I set up our command center in a nondescript warehouse in the industrial district of Cicero, Illinois. From the outside, it looked like any other abandoned building graffiti on the walls, weeds growing through the cracked parking lot. Inside, we had converted it into a state-of-the-art intelligence hub with secure communications, real-time satellite feeds, and enough processing power to rival a small tech company. Agent Maria Delgado was my second in command. Maria had grown up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of legal immigrants from Guatemala. She had lost a brother to gang violence when she was 16, a drive-by shooting that was never solved. That tragedy had driven her to law enforcement, and in 17 years, she had become one of the most effective agents in the Western region. "Boss, we've got a problem," Maria said one evening, dropping a thick folder on my desk. "Esteban Ochoa Reyes. He's moved." Ochoa Reyes was number 3 on our priority list, a former enforcer for the Sinaloa cartel who had fled to the U.S. after a power struggle left him on the wrong side of the new leadership. He'd been living in Phoenix under a fake identity, running a money laundering operation through a chain of car washes. Our intel had him at a specific address in Glendale, but Maria's sources were now saying he'd relocated. Where? San Diego, maybe Tijuana. Our informant isn't sure. I rubbed my temples. Operations like this were like dominoes. If one piece fell out of place, the whole thing could collapse. Get me confirmation within 48 hours. If he's in Tijuana, We coordinate with Mexican authorities. If he's in San Diego, we move up his extraction. Maria nodded and left. I turned back to the wall of photographs, names, and connecting threads that covered nearly every surface of my office. 847 faces, 847 stories of violence, exploitation, and broken laws. And somewhere in that web of criminality, there were answers we hadn't yet found. The intelligence work was painstaking. We cross-referenced FBI databases, DEA reports, local police records, and classified intercepts from Homeland Security. We interviewed informants in prisons across the country. We tracked social media accounts, wire transfers, and vehicle registrations. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, not just of individual criminals, but of the networks that supported them. One name kept appearing: Victor Sandoval Núñez. Sandoval Núñez was a Venezuelan national who had entered the United States through the southern border in 2019. On paper, he was an asylum seeker fleeing political persecution. In reality, he was a former member of the Colectivo's government-backed paramilitary groups, known for brutal violence against political opponents. He had been arrested 3 times in the U.S., once for assault, once for weapons possession, and once for human trafficking. But each time, he had been released due to technicalities or overwhelmed court systems. Now, according to our intelligence, Sandoval Núñez had risen to become the primary coordinator for human smuggling operations along the Texas-Mexico border. He was responsible for moving hundreds of migrants through the desert, charging them thousands of dollars for the journey. Those who couldn't pay were forced into labor or sex trafficking. Those who tried to escape were killed. I made him our #1 target. We need eyes on Sandoval Núñez around the clock. I told the team during our morning briefing, I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, who he talks to. I want to know when he takes a piss. Agent Derek Thompson, a former Dallas SWAT officer who had transferred to ICE 5 years ago, raised his hand. Boss, he's got protection. We've identified at least 6 armed associates who rotate through his compound in Laredo. These aren't street-level thugs, they're trained. Military backgrounds, probably Venezuelan special forces. Then we'll need to be smarter, I said. We don't engage directly until extraction night. Until then, we watch, we wait, and we gather everything we can. The weeks that followed tested every resource we had. We deployed surveillance drones, tapped phone lines with proper warrants, and cultivated sources within the migrant communities who were willing to risk their lives to help us. Slowly, we built a comprehensive picture of Sandoval Núñez's operation, his supply routes, his safe houses, his financial network. But intelligence work isn't just about gathering information. It's about understanding people. And as I studied Sandoval Núñez, I began to understand what made him so dangerous. He wasn't motivated by ideology or even greed. He was motivated by power, the pure, intoxicating rush of controlling other human beings. He enjoyed watching people suffer. He enjoyed the fear in their eyes. Men like that don't surrender. They don't negotiate. When we came for him, there would be violence. I accepted that. I had accepted it a long time ago. 3 weeks before the operation, I flew to Washington for a final briefing with the director. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at the DHS headquarters, windowless, swept for bugs, with armed guards at every entrance. Director Patricia Womack was a political appointee, but she wasn't a politician. She had spent 20 years at the FBI, including a stint as the special agent in charge of the New York field office. She understood the realities of law enforcement in ways that most Washington bureaucrats never would. "Walk me through the timeline," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. I stood at the front of the room, a laser pointer in my hand, and began the presentation. Operation Silent Departure will commence at 0400 hours on March 15th. We will execute simultaneous raids in 14 cities across 9 states. Primary targets, number 237 individuals, all with violent criminal histories and active deportation orders. Secondary targets, associates, facilitators, and known gang members bring the total to approximately 850. Transportation, we've secured 3 Boeing 737 seconds from the Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System. Each aircraft can hold up to 300 passengers under maximum security conditions. We'll stage at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas before final departure to Guatemala City, where we've coordinated with local authorities for receiving the deportees. Director Womack studied the map on the screen. What about resistance? I'm hearing chatter that some advocacy groups are planning to interfere. We've anticipated that, I said. Each raid team will be accompanied by local law enforcement for crowd control. We've also coordinated with the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force to monitor any organized attempts to obstruct the operation. She nodded slowly. And the political fallout? Significant, I admitted, but manageable. We've prepared comprehensive documentation on every individual, being removed criminal histories, court records, deportation orders. The facts speak for themselves. The director was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up and extended her hand. Get it done, Agent Bovino, and bring your people home safe. I shook her hand. Yes, ma'am. The night before the operation, I sat alone in my office, staring at the wall of faces. 847 lives, 847 decisions that had led them to this moment. I didn't hate them. Hatred was a luxury I couldn't afford. But I also didn't pity them. They had made choices. They had hurt people. They had violated the laws of a country that had given them opportunities they wouldn't have had anywhere else. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter. Be safe tomorrow, Dad. I love you. I typed back, always. Love you too, sweetheart. Sarah was 26 now, a nurse at Rush University Medical Center. She had inherited her mother's compassion and my stubbornness, a combination that made her exceptional at her job but difficult to argue with. She didn't always agree with my work, but she understood why I did it. That understanding meant more to me than I could ever express. I put the phone away and looked at the clock. Midnight. In 4 hours, we would begin. I closed my eyes and said a prayer, not for myself, but for the agents who would be risking their lives, for the families who would finally have justice, and yes, even for the men we would be removing, that somewhere in their futures they might find redemption. Then I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked out into the cold Chicago night. The operation was about to begin. The command center hummed with controlled tension. 53 agents sat at workstations arranged in a semicircle around a massive central screen that displayed a real-time map of the United States. 14 red dots pulsed across the country: Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, New York, Phoenix, Denver, Dallas, Atlanta, Seattle, Boston, Las Vegas, San Diego, and Detroit. Each dot represented a raid team. Each team had been assigned specific targets. Each target had been surveilled, documented, and analyzed until we knew their patterns better than they knew themselves. I stood at the elevated platform in the center of the room, headset on, watching the clock count down, 3:47. 13 minutes until we launched the largest coordinated immigration enforcement operation in American history. All teams, this is command, I said into the microphone. Sound off. The responses came in rapid succession, each team leader confirming readiness with the disciplined efficiency of professionals who understood that lives depended on precision. Chicago Alpha, standing by. LA Bravo, standing by. Houston, Charlie, standing by. Miami Delta, standing by. 14 teams, 187 field agents, countless hours of preparation, all leading to this moment. Maria Delgado appeared at my side, tablet in hand. Final satellite sweep is complete. All primary targets are confirmed at their locations. No unusual activity detected. What about Sandoval Nunez? Still in the compound. 6 guards on rotation, just like Thompson predicted. Laredo team is in position. I nodded. Sandoval Nunez was the linchpin. If we could take him cleanly, the rest of the operation would fall into place. If something went wrong in Laredo, we risked a domino effect that could compromise everything. 3:52. 8 minutes. I thought about the families sleeping in houses across America, unaware that justice was about to arrive at their neighbors' doors. I thought about Emily Dawson, the girl whose murder had set all of this in motion. I thought about every victim whose story had never made the news, the women trafficked into prostitution, the workers enslaved in illegal operations, the children caught in the crossfire of gang violence. This was for them, all of it. 3:58, 2 minutes. Command to all teams, I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Final weapons check. Confirm tactical positions. The confirmations rolled in. Every team was ready. Every agent was in place. 4. Execute. The Chicago raid was my responsibility. I had insisted on leading it personally, despite Maria's protests that a senior agent should remain at the command center. But I hadn't spent 6 months planning this operation to watch it unfold on a screen. I needed to be in the field. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Our primary target in Chicago was Dmitry Volkov, a Ukrainian national who had overstayed a student visa 15 years ago and had since built a small empire of illegal gambling operations and loan sharking. He had been convicted of aggravated assault twice, served a total of 4 years in prison, and had been issued a deportation order that had languished in administrative limbo for 3 years. More recently, our intelligence indicated that he had expanded into arms trafficking, supplying weapons to street gangs across the Midwest. Volkov lived in a renovated brownstone in the Wicker Park neighborhood, gentrified, expensive, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business, perfect cover for a man who didn't want to be found. Our team consisted of 12 agents, plus 4 Chicago PD officers who would provide perimeter security. We approached in 3 unmarked vehicles, lights off, rolling to a stop half a block from the target address. The street was silent. A thin layer of frost covered the parked cars. The temperature was 17 degrees cold enough to make your breath visible, cold enough to make every movement feel sluggish. Alpha team breach positions, I whispered into my radio. The agents moved like shadows, spreading out to cover all exits. 2 positioned themselves at the rear of the building. 2 more covered the basement entrance. The remaining 8 formed up at the front door, battering ram ready. I pulled my sidearm, a Glock 19 that I had carried for 11 years, and took my position behind the breach team. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, execute. The battering ram hit the door with a thunderous crash. The lock splintered, and the door flew inward. Agents poured through the opening, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices shouting commands. ICE, federal agents, everyone on the ground. We cleared the first floor in seconds. Living room, kitchen, dining area, empty. The sound of footsteps above us confirmed that Volkov was upstairs. Second floor, move. I followed the team up the narrow staircase, weapon raised, heart pounding. At the top of the stairs, a door slammed shut. One of my agents kicked it open without hesitation. Inside, we found Dmitry Volkov standing in the middle of his bedroom, hands raised, wearing nothing but boxer shorts and a gold chain around his neck. He was shorter than I expected, maybe 5 to 7, with the thick build of a man who had spent years lifting weights in prison yards. His eyes darted between the agents, calculating, looking for an opening that didn't exist. "Mr. Volkov," I said, stepping forward, "you are under arrest pursuant to a federal deportation order issued by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in immigration proceedings." Volkov said nothing. He just smiled a cold, reptilian smile that never reached his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" he said finally, his accent thick, despite his years in America. "You arrest me, someone else takes my place. You arrest him, another one comes. This is business. Business never stops." "Maybe," I said, "but you're done." We cuffed him, searched the residence, and escorted him to the transport vehicle. Total time, from breach to extraction, 7 minutes. 1 down. 846 to go. The reports from other cities began flooding into the command center. Los Angeles had taken down 18 targets in a coordinated sweep across East LA, including 2 documented MS-13 shot callers who had been linked to multiple homicides. Houston had apprehended 31 individuals, many of them connected to Gulf cartel operations along the Texas border. Miami had secured 24 targets, including a Cuban national who had been running a prostitution ring out of a chain of massage parlors. But it was the Laredo operation that had everyone holding their breath. Agent Derek Thompson's voice crackled over the secure channel. "Command, this is Laredo team. We have eyes on the compound. 6 tangos confirmed. Sandoval Nunez is in the main building, 2nd floor, requesting permission to proceed." I had returned to the command center by then, watching the live drone feed on the central screen. The compound was a sprawling property on the outskirts of the city, a main house, 2 outbuildings, and a high fence topped with razor wire. The guards moved in predictable patterns, but they were alert, professional. This wouldn't be easy. "Laredo team, you are authorized to proceed," I said. "Rules of engagement. Defensive fire only unless directly threatened. Priority is taking Sandoval Nunez alive." "Copy that, Command. Moving in." I watched as Thompson's team began their approach, using the terrain to mask their movements. They had rehearsed this dozens of times in simulation, but simulation never captured the chaos of real-world operations. There were always variables you couldn't predict. The first gunshot came 3 minutes into the approach. "Contact, contact." Thompson's voice was sharp but controlled. Southwest Perimeter Guard engaged our position, returning fire. On the drone feed, I saw muzzle flashes in the darkness. 2 of Thompson's agents had pinned down the guard behind a parked truck. More gunfire erupted from the main house. The other guards had been alerted. "Command, we need backup," Thompson said. "They're laying down suppressive fire. We can't advance." I turned to Maria. "Get Laredo PD SWAT on the line." Now, the next 8 minutes were the longest of my life. Thompson's team held their ground, exchanging fire with the guards while waiting for reinforcement. One agent took a round to his vest, painful but not life-threatening. Another was grazed on the shoulder, but they held. When the SWAT team arrived, they hit the compound from 3 directions simultaneously. The resistance collapsed within minutes. 4 guards were killed, 2 surrendered, and Victor Sandoval Nunez was found hiding in a basement closet, clutching a satellite phone that he had been using to coordinate escape routes for his associates across the border. "Command, this is Laredo team," Thompson reported, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "High-value target is in custody. Compound is secure." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Outstanding work, Laredo. Outstanding work. By noon, the full scope of our success was becoming clear. Across the country, we had apprehended 792 individuals. Another 43 were apprehended in secondary raids conducted based on intelligence gathered during the initial operations. The remaining 12 had either fled before we arrived or were not at their documented locations. We would track them down in the days to come. But success came at a cost. In Houston, Agent Carlos Mendez had been shot during a breach when a target produced a weapon hidden under his mattress. The bullet had punctured his lung. He was in surgery at Ben Taub Hospital, condition critical. In Los Angeles, Agent Jennifer Park had been struck by a fleeing vehicle as a target attempted to escape on foot through a residential neighborhood. She had 2 broken legs and a fractured pelvis. In Miami, a target had detonated a small explosive device as agents entered his apartment, a booby trap that we hadn't anticipated. 2 agents had sustained burns and shrapnel wounds. I visited each of them in the days that followed, sitting by their hospital beds, thanking them for their sacrifice. Carlos Mendez survived barely. He would never return to field work, but he was alive. Jennifer Park faced months of rehabilitation, but the doctors were optimistic. The Miami agents were treated and released within a week. We had been lucky. It could have been so much worse. The processing phase began immediately after the raids concluded. Each individual was transported to one of 3 designated detention facilities: Florence, Arizona; Dilley, Texas; or Tacoma, Washington. There, they were photographed, fingerprinted, medically screened, and interviewed by immigration officers to confirm their identities and criminal histories. I spent 4 days at the Florence facility, overseeing the processing and ensuring that every protocol was followed. The critics would be watching. The lawyers would be scrutinizing. We couldn't afford a single mistake. I remember walking through the holding area on the 2nd day, looking at the faces of the men we had apprehended. Some were defiant, cursing at the guards, threatening revenge. Others were resigned, defeated, their eyes empty of hope. A few were genuinely remorseful, or at least performed remorse well enough to seem genuine. One man caught my attention. He was sitting in the corner of his cell, reading a paperback novel. Unlike the others, he seemed almost serene, as if he had been expecting this, waiting for it, perhaps even welcoming it. I approached the cell. "What's your name?" He looked up. Eduardo Vargas Montoya. I checked my tablet. Vargas Montoya had been arrested in Denver. He was a Colombian national with convictions for drug distribution and money laundering. He had been deported once in 2016 and had re-entered illegally within 6 months. "You don't seem upset," I said. He shrugged. "I've been running for a long time. Maybe it's time to stop." "What were you running from?" Vargas Montoya closed his book and set it aside. "The same thing everyone runs from. The past, the things we've done, the people we've hurt." He paused. "You ever hurt anyone, Agent Bovino?" The question caught me off guard. "I've done my job." "That's not an answer." I didn't respond. There was something in his eyes, not challenge, not hostility, but something like recognition, as if he saw in me the same weight that I saw in him. "We all have our burdens," Vargas Montoya said. "We just carry them differently." I walked away without another word, but his question stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments between briefings and phone calls and paperwork. Had I hurt anyone? Of course I had. Every deportation was a disruption, families separated, lives uprooted, dreams destroyed. I had made peace with that reality long ago. justifying it as the necessary cost of maintaining order, protecting the innocent, upholding the law. But peace isn't the same as absence of doubt, and doubt, I was learning, never truly goes away. The Boeing 737-800 sat on the tarmac at Laughlin Air Force Base like a sleeping giant. In the pre-dawn darkness, it looked almost serene, a commercial aircraft stripped of its logos, painted in the dull gray of government service. But appearances were deceiving. Inside that plane were 283 of the most dangerous criminals we had apprehended, bound and shackled, awaiting transport to a life they had tried to escape. This was the first of 3 flights. By the end of the week, all 847 individuals would be removed from U.S. soil. I stood on the tarmac with Maria, watching as the detainees were loaded in groups of 20. Each group was escorted by armed agents who guided them up the mobile stairway and into the cabin. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic, an assembly line of justice that moved with quiet efficiency. "You should get some sleep," Maria said. "You've been up for 40 hours. I'll sleep when this is done." She didn't argue. She knew me too well for that. The loading process took nearly 3 hours. Each detainee had to be searched, documented, and secured in their seat with specialized restraints that allowed limited movement but prevented any possibility of violence. Medical personnel checked vital signs and distributed necessary medications. Immigration officers verified identities one final time. Victor Sandoval Nunez was loaded last. He walked with his head high, eyes scanning the tarmac as if memorizing every detail. When he passed me, he paused. "Agent Bovino," he said. "I know your name now. I know your face. I will not forget." I met his gaze without flinching. "Good. Remember it the next time you think about coming back." He smiled that same cold smile I had seen on a dozen predators before him. "There is always a way back. You cannot build a wall high enough to stop men like me." "Maybe not," I said. "But I can make you wish you'd never tried." The agents escorted him up the stairs and into the plane. I watched until he disappeared inside, then turned to Maria. "Let's go." I flew on the first aircraft. It wasn't required. I could have remained at the base and monitored the flights from the ground, but I felt a responsibility to see this through personally. These men were my responsibility. Their safe transport was my obligation. The interior of the plane had been modified for prisoner transport. The seats were arranged in rows of 3, with heavy-duty restraints bolted to the frames. A reinforced bulkhead separated the detainees from the crew area. Armed agents patrolled the aisles, maintaining constant vigilance. I sat in the forward section, behind the bulkhead, reviewing paperwork as the plane taxied to the runway. The engines roared to life, and we accelerated into the gray morning sky. Below us, Texas fell away, the Rio Grande glittering in the early light, the border that so many had crossed illegally, the line that divided 2 worlds. The flight to Guatemala City would take approximately 4 hours. I used the time to catch up on reports from the other detention facilities. The processing was proceeding smoothly. No major incident, no successful legal challenges yet. About 2 hours into the flight, one of the patrol agents approached me. "Sir, we have a situation in row 23. I followed him down the aisle, past rows of silent detainees who watched us with varying degrees of hostility and fear. In row 23, a man was convulsing in his seat, body rigid, eyes rolled back, foam forming at the corners of his mouth. "Medical emergency," I shouted. "Get the doc up here." Our flight medic, Dr. James Carruthers, pushed through within seconds. He assessed the situation with practiced calm, checking vitals, administering medication, issuing instructions. "He's having a seizure," Carruthers said. "Possibly drug withdrawal. I need space to work." We cleared the surrounding rows, moving other detainees to available seats while Carruthers stabilized the patient. For 15 agonizing minutes, the man's life hung in the balance, his body fighting against itself while we fought to save him. Finally, the convulsions stopped. The man's breathing steadied. Carruthers leaned back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He'll live," he said, "but he needs hospital care as soon as we land. I've done everything I can up here." I nodded, then returned to my seat. The incident had reminded me of something I sometimes forgot in the chaos of operations and paperwork. These were human beings. Dangerous, yes. Criminals, certainly. But human beings nonetheless. They had families, histories, dreams that had curdled into nightmares. Whatever they had done, they didn't deserve to die on a plane at 35,000 feet. We landed at La Aurora International Airport in Guatemala City shortly after noon local time. The Guatemalan authorities had prepared for our arrival immigration officers, security personnel, and government officials lined up on the tarmac like a receiving line for a visiting dignitary. The transfer process was coordinated down to the minute. Each detainee was handed over to Guatemalan custody with full documentation, criminal records, identification papers, and detailed notes on any medical conditions or security concerns. For most of them, this was the end of the line. Guatemala would process their cases, coordinate with their home countries, and ultimately return them to wherever they had come from. For a few, the high-value targets like Sandoval Núñez, there were additional considerations. Venezuela had issued warrants for several of its nationals, and we had coordinated with their government for secondary transfers. It was a diplomatic dance that had taken weeks to choreograph. I watched as Sandoval Núñez was escorted off the plane and into the hands of waiting Venezuelan security officers. His face was blank, now the bravado of the tarmac at Laughlin replaced by something more calculating, more cautious. He knew what awaited him back home. Whatever justice America had denied him, Venezuela would provide. Was it enough? I didn't know. Nothing would bring back the women he had trafficked, the migrants who had died in the desert under his watch. Justice was always imperfect, always incomplete, but it was something, and sometimes something was all we had. I stayed in Guatemala City for 2 days, coordinating the arrival of the second and third flights. By the time the last detainee had been transferred, we had set a new record. 847 criminal aliens removed in a single coordinated operation. The media coverage was intense, some praising us as heroes defending American communities, others condemning us as jackbooted thugs terrorizing immigrant families. I didn't read the articles. I didn't watch the news segments. The opinions of people who had never walked a mile in my shoes didn't interest me. What interested me was the data: violent crime rates, recidivism statistics, human trafficking networks. Those numbers would tell the real story in the months and years to come. On my last night in Guatemala, I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, looking out over the city. The lights of Guatemala City stretched to the horizon, a sea of illumination that masked the poverty and violence that existed in its shadows. Somewhere out there, new networks were already forming, new traffickers stepping in to fill the void we had created. The job was never done. It would never be done. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth doing. My phone buzzed. A text from Maria: "Good work, boss. Come home." I typed back, "On my way." The return to normalcy is always the hardest part. After the adrenaline of the operation, the intensity of the flights, and the diplomatic complexities of the transfer, coming back to the Chicago field office felt almost anticlimactic. The fluorescent lights still hummed, the coffee machine still dispensed the same burnt-tasting sludge. The paperwork still accumulated on my desk in ever-growing piles. But things had changed. I could feel it in the way people looked at me, talked to me, moved around me. Operation Silent Departure had elevated my profile in ways I hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely welcome. Deputy Director Wells was hinting at promotion. The Secretary of Homeland Security wanted to feature me in a press conference. Reporters were requesting interviews, book agents were leaving voicemails, and someone had apparently created a fan page on social media that I refused to look at. I wanted none of it. I had done my job, nothing more, nothing less. The celebration felt premature, even inappropriate, because I knew something that the media and the politicians didn't. This was just the beginning. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the operation concluded. I was in my office, reviewing intelligence reports on trafficking patterns along the Arizona border, when Maria burst through the door. "We have a problem," she said. "A big one." Define big. Judge Morrison just issued a temporary restraining order blocking all deportation flights until a full review of our targeting criteria can be conducted. I felt my stomach drop. Judge Eleanor Morrison was a federal judge in the Ninth Circuit, known for her expansive interpretations of immigration law and her hostility toward enforcement operations. We had anticipated legal challenges, but not this quickly and not this broadly. On what grounds? She's claiming we violated due process for some of the detainees. Apparently, several of them had pending asylum claims that weren't properly adjudicated before their removal. I stood up, pacing the length of my office. We had been meticulous, every target had been vetted, every case reviewed by legal counsel. If there had been pending asylum claims, they should have been flagged in our system. "Get me the files on those individuals," I said, "and get legal on the phone. We need to respond to this immediately." The next several days were consumed by damage control. Our legal team filed an emergency appeal. I testified in closed session before the House Judiciary Committee. Maria coordinated with field offices to verify the documentation on every single detainee. In the end, we found the problem. 5 of the individuals we had deported had in fact filed asylum claims that were still pending in immigration court. The claims were weak, none of them would likely have been granted, but they were technically active, which meant the individuals had a legal right to remain in the country until their cases were decided. 5 out of 847, a success rate of 99.4%. By any reasonable measure, an overwhelming accomplishment. But the law doesn't care about statistics. The law cares about individual cases. And in those 5 cases, we had made a mistake. This is exactly what they wanted, Maria said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. They don't care about the other 842 criminals we removed. They care about finding one flaw, one crack they can exploit to tear down everything we've built. She wasn't wrong, but that didn't mean we could ignore the problem. Justice had to be blind, even when it was inconvenient. The legal battle dragged on for months. Eventually, the restraining order was lifted, and the 5 individuals in question were located and offered the opportunity to return to the United States to pursue their asylum claims. 3 accepted, 2 declined. They had found new lives elsewhere and didn't want to uproot themselves again. The political fallout was significant. Several advocacy groups filed civil suits against ICE, naming me personally as a defendant. Congressional hearings examined every aspect of the operation, with some legislators praising our work and others calling for my resignation. The media coverage shifted from celebration to scrutiny, with investigative reporters digging into every aspect of my career. Through it all, I kept my head down and did my job. The criticism stung, especially the ones that questioned my integrity or accused me of targeting innocent people, but I had learned long ago that public opinion was a fickle thing. What mattered was the truth. And the truth was that we had removed hundreds of violent criminals from American streets, disrupted major trafficking networks, and sent a clear message to those who thought they could exploit our immigration system with impunity. 6 months after the operation, I received a letter that reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. It came from Minneapolis, from a woman named Catherine Dawson, Emily's mother. Dear Agent Bovino, I don't know if you remember me. We met briefly at my daughter's funeral. You probably thought I didn't notice you standing in the back, but I did, and I've thought about you often since then. When I heard about Operation Silent Departure, I cried. Not because of the controversy or the politics. I honestly don't care about any of that. I cried because someone was finally doing something. Someone was finally fighting back. Emily is gone. Nothing will bring her back. But knowing that the man who killed her won't hurt anyone else's daughter, knowing that hundreds of other dangerous criminals have been removed from this country, that gives me something I haven't felt in a long time. Hope. Thank you, Agent Bovino. Thank you for fighting for people like Emily. Thank you for not giving up. With gratitude, Catherine Dawson. I sat in my office, reading that letter over and over, until the words blurred behind tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed in months. All the criticism, all the political battles, all the sleepless nights, they faded away in the face of those simple words. Thank you for fighting. That was all I had ever wanted. Not recognition, not promotion, not media attention. Just the knowledge that my work mattered, that the sacrifices meant something, that somewhere out there a mother could sleep a little easier knowing that justice had been served. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer next to a photograph of Emily Dawson that I had kept since that rainy day in Minneapolis. Then I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked out into the Chicago morning. The work was never done. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Epilogue. 1 year later, the sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold when I pulled into the parking lot of the Navy Pier. It was a warm September evening, the kind that made you forget about the brutal winters that Chicago was famous for. Families walked along the pier, children chased seagulls, couples held hands as they watched the boats glide across the harbor. I wasn't here for the view. Maria Delgado was waiting for me at our usual spot, a bench near the entrance to the Shakespeare Theater, where we had held dozens of informal meetings over the years. She was wearing civilian clothes, which meant this wasn't about work, or at least not about current work. You're late, she said, but there was no reproach in her voice. Traffic. I sat down beside her, loosening my tie. What's this about? Maria handed me a manila folder. I did some digging. Off the books. Something didn't sit right with me about the Sandoval Nunez case. I opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, intercepted communications, a dossier that must have taken months to compile. What am I looking at? Sandoval Nunez was repatriated to Venezuela, just like we planned. But 3 months ago, he was released from custody. No charges filed, no trial, no explanation. He's back in business, Gregory. Running the same trafficking routes through Central America. Different country, same operation. I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest. How is that possible? The Venezuelan government had warrants. They promised us he would be prosecuted. Politics, Maria said, her voice bitter. Apparently he has connections to people in the Maduro regime. Friends in high places who decided he was more valuable as an asset than as a prisoner. I stared at the photograph Sandoval Nunez at a cafe in Caracas. Sandoval Nunez boarding a private plane. Sandoval Nunez meeting with men who wore the unmistakable look of government officials. The same predator, the same cold eyes, the same reptilian smile. We had caught him. We had removed him. And the system had failed anyway. What do we do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We adapt, Maria said. We learn. We do better next time. I closed the folder and looked out at the lake. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving behind only the fading glow of twilight. Somewhere out there, beyond the water and the sky, men like Sandoval Nunez were continuing their work, trafficking, exploiting, destroying lives. The job was never done. It would never be done. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth doing. 1 year after Operation Silent Departure, I stood before a new class of ICE agents at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. 32 men and women who had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting American communities, who had accepted the sacrifices, the criticisms, the endless paperwork, and the moments of doubt that came with this career. Let me tell you a story, I began, about a 14-year-old girl named Emily Dawson. I spoke for an hour, sharing the lessons I had learned over 24 years in law enforcement, the importance of intelligence, the necessity of precision, the weight of responsibility that came with the power to change lives. But more than anything, I spoke about persistence. You will fail, I told them. You will make mistakes. You will watch criminals slip through your fingers and predators escape justice. You will be criticized, second-guessed, and attacked by people who have never walked in your shoes. And there will be days, many days, when you wonder if any of it matters. I paused, letting the words sink in. It matters. Every arrest, every deportation, every operation that protects an innocent life. It matters. Not because we can solve every problem or catch every criminal, but because we refuse to stop trying. Because we believe that justice is worth fighting for, even when the odds are against us, even when the system fails, even when it feels like we're swimming against an endless tide. I looked at the faces before me, young, earnest, full of idealism that had not yet been tested by reality. I won't promise you victory, I said, but I can promise you meaning. And in this work, meaning is everything. After the lecture, I drove to the airport for my flight back to Chicago. As I waited at the gate, I pulled out my phone and looked at the photograph on my lock screen. Sarah and me at her nursing school graduation, both of us smiling in the bright May sunshine. She had texted me that morning, "Dinner Sunday? I have news." I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it. Love you." The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. I stood up, gathered my things, and walked toward the plane. Behind me, another operation was already taking shape. New targets, new intelligence, new plans to protect American communities from those who would do them harm. Ahead of me, a Sunday dinner with my daughter, and whatever news she had to share. The job was never done. But life, real life, the kind that mattered, continued alongside it. And in the space between duty and family, I had found something that sustained me through all the darkness: purpose. I boarded the plane and took my seat by the window. As we lifted off into the evening sky, I looked down at the lights of Georgia falling away beneath us, countless homes, countless families, countless lives that we had sworn to protect. 847. That was the number everyone remembered. But for me, the number that mattered was one. One girl. One promise. One reminder that behind every statistic was a human story. Emily Dawson's story had ended in tragedy. But in her memory, I had found the strength to fight for those who could still be saved. And I would keep fighting until there was nothing left to give.